This is Garis, Masculist MGTOW flyers. That is 2 3-page essays on the themes of Masculism and MGTOW, written by and read aloud by Prof. Dr. Hugo de Garis. This is flyer number 346, entitled Journalists are Gender Political Genociders. Description. This flyer claims that if the journalists and media people do not spread Masculist ideas quickly enough, then the Masculists will accuse them of being indirect genociders, because the journalists will take some of the responsibility for the population crash. The Masculists will stop third-wave feminism that has taken over the divorce courts, making them so toxic for men that 2/3 and more of young men are now rejecting marriage and paternity, which will wipe out whole populations. Masculists aim to destroy third-wave feminism by either intellectually crushing it with Masculist science, or if that fails, by simply shooting the feminazis in a sex war. It is the journalists who have a responsibility to spread Masculist ideas, so that the more benign approach to the destruction of the third-wave feminists can get off the ground, by the journalists spreading Masculist ideas to the public, so that no longer believes in third-wave feminism, so that the gender laws can be menfaired, so that young men are prepared to be fathers again before whole populations get wiped out. By itself. What? It's not usual. Oh, wait a minute, here it is. Journalists are indirect gender political genociders, by Prof. Dr. Hugo de Garis. Email profhugodegaris@yahoo.com. Website profhugodegaris.wordpress.com. This flyer claims that the journalists and media people in general, that is radio, TV, magazines, newspapers, TV documentaries, etc., are indirect genociders. This may sound bizarre, so I need to explain. There's definitely a logic behind it, but it requires a chain of reasoning. Firstly, it's the Masculists who are making this claim, and the argument they use is based on Masculist ideas, Masculist priorities. The argument goes as follows. The hated, fluffy feminist hypocrites have taken over the divorce courts and made them so toxic for men that in many countries today, 2/3 of young men under 35 refuse to marry, reject paternity, and probably within a decade that fraction will have risen to above 90%. This is a catastrophe, because with such massive rejection of paternity, we wipe ourselves out within a mere generation. So obviously these feminazis have to be stopped. But how? The Masculists see two major alternative solutions to this paternity rejection problem. The feminazis, in their characteristically childish way, will blame men for the paternity rejection. One thing that the feminazis never do is point the finger at themselves, taking some of the responsibility for their negative situation due to women's genetic inferiority, women's failure to take responsibility for their own lives. The Masculists claim that their paternity rejection is a reaction against the toxicity of the divorce courts, taken over by the hated, fluffy feminist hypocrites who see men as cash machines to be robbed, abused, and treated as morally inferior creatures. These fluffy feminist hypocrites want equal rights with men in the parliaments, but behave as fluffy parasites in the divorce courts, not bothering to become FIPs, that's financially independent persons, who reject wanting equal obligations with men in bothering to get a career-competent education so that they can become FIPs as adults. Thus these fluffy feminists are hypocrites in the sense that they want to have their cake and to eat it too. They want the benefits of having equal rights with men, but reject the costs of having to share the burden with men of earning the living by fipping up and taking responsibility for their own lives. Thus fluffy feminist hypocrites have made divorce toxic for males. Any man in a Western country who marries and becomes a father faces a 1 in 4 chance of being financially massacred and having his life ruined in a hated, fluffy feminist dominated divorce court system. A man who marries and becomes a father is thus playing Russian roulette with his life. But instead of there being the usual 6 chambers in the barrel, there are only 4. That is, if he marries and becomes a father, he has 1 chance in 4 that his life will be destroyed. Most divorce court lawyers and judges are monoconscious feminazis, that is, have had only their feminist consciousness raised, who know nothing about masculism, who see men as a morally inferior, toxic sex, who need to be punished for their centuries-long oppression of women as seen by feminists. Therefore, these feminazi witches then financially crucify divorcing fathers, stripping a man of his kids with 90% probability, losing his house to his ex-wife, forced to pay over half of his stuff to her, forced to pay child payments to kids he will barely see. He will lose his house to his ex-wife so that she can raise her kids in it. And if the ex-wife is a real fluffy, that's a traditional woman who expects to be able to parasite off the money of a man, he may have to pay her alimony for the rest of her life, with no legal nor moral obligation on her to fip up to get a career, allowing her to remain, which allows her to remain a parasite of him after the divorce the way she was before the divorce. Millions of young men in Western countries have observed what happened to their fathers, their uncles, their older male friends, and have decided to wipe their hands of marriage, of fatherhood, of being such a shitty deal for men that marriage is avoided by them at a rate of 2/3 in several major countries now, e.g. the US, Japan, Germany, etc. Thus the main blame for this situation is the feminazis, who have made the divorce courts toxic, so that young men now reject paternity, which is a huge issue because it wipes out whole populations in less than a century. Since Masculist and MGTOW videos are being viewed literally in their millions over the past few years, MGTOW and Masculist ideas are spreading to millions of men, especially young men, who agree with the Masculists and MGTOW that it is stupid to marry, and especially to have kids, since doing such a thing is effectively playing Russian roulette with your life, your male life. So not surprisingly, probably within a decade, the proportion of young men rejecting marriage and paternity will be over 90%, which is a social catastrophe, because if one does the math, one sees that whole populations will be wiped out within a generation or so. Thus the fluffy feminazis in the divorce courts have to be stopped. But how? One approach is simply to shoot these feminazis, that is, to go on a sex war, to assassinate the hated gender politicians, who made these deeply misandrous gender laws in the first place, then murder thousands of feminazi divorce court lawyers and judges. And if the sex war really escalates, then responsible males, masculine soldiers, will go out into the streets with black lists and simply shoot thousands of women who are feminazis. Women will then lose the right to vote, and men will menfaired the gender laws, for example, by making divorce non-toxic for males, bringing in the paternity rejection right, socially engineering the fipping of women by putting heavy moral pressure on young women to fip up or be punished by men by not having one, being forced to rot on the shelf by being totally ignored by men, not even being pumped and dumped. Masculine soldiers will simply not tolerate that these feminazi bitches indirectly wipe out whole populations. They will shoot them first as the lesser evil. However, there's a much more benign alternative, and that is to use masculist science to destroy third-wave feminism, which is the branch of feminism that aims to empower women, treating the acquisition of power as a zero-sum game. The power gained by women is power lost by men. The third wave feminists have taken over the divorce courts and have made them toxic for men. The most formidable enemy of the third wave feminists are the masculist scientists, who are out to destroy third wave feminism by intellectually crushing it, rendering it literally unbelievable, by crushing its core arguments, for example, by showing via scientific evidence that women are not the equal of men. Men are genetically superior to women on average, thanks largely to women's hypergamy, that is, women's instinct to mate up with a superior man, whose superior DNA she wants for her child, so that her child's DNA is superior to hers, and that is good for the species, so evolved. All women have it, and as a side effect, men are genetically superior to women, because for a million years or more, women have been sexually selecting men who were genetically superior to them. Thus men are taller, bigger, stronger, fiercer, and smarter than women, because those traits were sexually selected by women over thousands of generations. Thus the patriarchy that the feminists talk about, that is, the general male dominance of society, with most of the positions of power and prestige taken by men, is a side effect of women's sexual preferences. This is to be expected, because women's hypergamous nature largely generated this situation. Thus the feminazis are irrationally fighting something that they themselves largely created. Another major cause of the patriarchy is men's GMV, greater male variance. That is, men's scores on anything measurable are more spread out than women's, whose scores are more bunched up about their average score, so that the bottom and top scoring individuals are male. So the patriarchy is genetically determined and hence not removable by feminazi pressure. In concrete terms, this means that men are smarter than women by 4 IQ points. Men have a 10% larger IQ variance than women. Men have 10% larger brains than women. So invent everything, build everything, create everything, and win 99% of the Science Nobel Prizes. Men have much higher testosterone levels than women, so are much more aggressive, ambitious, dogged, persistent, so achieve difficult tasks much more readily than women, so naturally have higher status in society than women, due to men's greatly superior track record. Masculist scientists can use arguments like the above to destroy third-wave feminism by intellectually crushing it, showing society that third-wave feminism is based on sand, makes no sense, and is not believable, so should not be believed, and hence should be abandoned, forgotten about. But the Masculists have a problem, and that is that their ideas have not yet reached the general public, due to the journalists not yet having taken up the Masculist torch to teach the millions in the general public of Masculist ideas. This failure of the journalists to preach the Masculist message is due partly to simple ignorance of Masculist ideas and partly due to cowardice, since many third-wave feminists are now in positions of power within media organisation hierarchies, who are monoconscious, who know nothing of Masculist ideas, and who become hostile towards young junior journalists who want to give the Masculists a voice in the media. Thus the Masculists are saying that the journalists are indirect genociders because they are not telling their media publics, the millions, the billions, that the feminazis have to be stopped, because these feminazis are indirectly wiping out whole populations. That is, they have become indirect genociders due to having made marriage and divorce toxic for men. The longer the journalists reject masculism, the more hostile the Masculists will become towards them, because the journalists are a vital stepping stone for the Masculists to get their message out to the public. In order that a sex war can be avoided and that third-wave feminazi attitudes and ideas can be destroyed, the more benign approach of the Masculist scientists needs to become successful. But that in turn requires that the general public, in all their millions, become familiar with Masculist ideas and be taught that the third-wave feminazis have become indirect genociders who are wiping out whole populations, so have to be stopped. If the journalists do not teach their publics, then the financial massacring of one father in four in the fluffy feminist hypocrite-controlled divorce court system will continue, so that we get wiped out. Therefore, the journalists will share a lot of the blame for this genocide of whole populations, for failing to spread masculist ideas to the public. If the journalists do not spread masculist ideas to the public, then it will be easier. If the journalists do spread masculist ideas to the public, then it will be easier for the public to sympathise with the masculists and join with them to destroy the third-wave feminazis, so that the feminazis are removed by helping the masculist scientists destroy credibility in the core ideas of the third-wave feminists. After half a century of second and third-wave feminism, most journalists are as monoconscious as the feminazis, so their first reaction when hearing masculist ideas is one of derision. Masculists have to put moral pressure on the journalists to spread masculist ideas, so that the general public understands that third-wave feminism has to be wiped out, or we all get wiped out, literally by having our populations being wiped out, in the sense of not being replaced due to too few births, due to the paternity rejection of MGTOW and masculist influenced males, who in turn are reacting to the toxicity of the divorce courts created by the hated fluffy feminist hypocrites. The longer the journalists refuse to present masculist ideas to the general public, the more responsibility these journalists will share with the third-wave feminazis for the wiping out of whole populations. In that sense, the journalists will have become indirect gender political genociders as well. They will then deserve a lot of the blame when our populations crash badly, a situation that could have been avoided if the journalists had been more morally and politically responsible and visionary, and had stepped up to the plate earlier, before the population crash became major. Cheers. Prof. Dr. Hugo de Garis. Email profhugodegaris@yahoo.com. Website profhugodegaris.wordpress.com. In brackets, contains links to nearly 350 YouTube, Minds, BitChute, Masculist essays/videos, and to the freely downloadable book Masculism, Men's Rebellion Against Being Manslaves to Women, an e-textbook of 300 plus masculist flyers for men's studies courses. Ciao.